what we really need to move towards is real-time monitoring of actual data flows. Once you're deployed, you're not going to revisit a 30-page DPIA. So I think we're going to see a lot more of ecosystem plays in which the retailer owning shopping data is now going to try to use data clean room to match some insights around a purchase intent.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, we've got Thomas Ghys here today, and he's worked as a management consultant, data scientist, and data strategist, including a 5-year stint at McKinsey prior to setting up his own privacy engineering practice. He's got deep expertise in MarTech and AdTech, auditing traditional machine learning models and data flows. He's also the founder and CEO of WebClue, a tool that helps with the auditing of websites and mobile apps, and has helped launch Bloom Up, a mental well-being platform. With Thomas, we're going to discuss 3 different takes on the privacy engineer's role, mostly as it pertains to digital marketing activities. Let's go for it. Thomas, thanks for joining me.
Very glad to be here, Sergio.
Great. So how do you see the role of the privacy engineer? That role, how will you define it, or where do you see it has an impact?
It's a role that definitely needs to complement the typical roles of a privacy manager and a DPO. And I think it's a term that describes what I've been doing in the last 8 years or so, but I have to acknowledge it means different things to different people. And so I kind of distinguish different manifestations of versions of that role that I've played. So first, I would call the builder of privacy enhancing tech within applications like marketing, advertising, where I've done most of my work, as a kind of a privacy preserving engineer, right? So I've helped a sales house set up data management platforms, from the start, where you can really think about pseudonymization, hashing, encryption, all the way through. And that's really building tech with privacy in mind. Now, the second role is the one of data translators, which I borrow from data strategy, and where this term has been used for a longer time. And this is about interfacing, on the one hand, the compliance and the legal team, and the data owners and development teams on the other hand. A lot of that role involves basically breaking down the complex overlapping legislation and enforcement into very actionable requirements on a technical level. It also very much covers, I find, that the DPIA work that you typically do, because if you're doing a really good DPIA, you have been able to speak to all these different contributors to the project, and you've really made the synthesis of what will this product or service mean for customers? How is it built? What are risks in a very holistic way? And that typically requires data translation skills. Now, the third role that I'm trying to get into more is the one of a privacy auditor in a more programmatic way. So I've been doing a lot of work in which I've been indeed chasing the organization, trying to pull together all of this insight into the way things work in marketing, or the way, for example, programmatic advertising works. And that definitely has merit, but at some point you will reach limits, especially where in the field that I love working on, where GDPR and e-privacy collide, when there's a lot of tracking going on and a lot of third-party vendors. That's where you'll reach limits to this approach. And I think with privacy auditing, what we really need to move towards is real-time monitoring of actual data flows, and move more from risk assessments to threat detection and instant responses to those threats. And so, yeah, that's what I've been focusing much more on in the last 2 years, and then in the last year or so, really also deep diving into mobile applications, where now in France there's a lot of attention with the actions announced by the CNIL.
So to your points, so something that I've been teaching the CIPT course at the IAPP. I see different layers within that kind of training. One of them is at the higher level, you've got the privacy technologist, as we call it, right? And that's sort of that translator that you're referring to. So someone that can help the teams build a DPIA or a PIA. Then there'll be a second layer. And then I see that breaking down also into two different camps. One of them is more software focused, where you understand the code and you can go deeper into things like the client side, DOM, JavaScript, whatever is happening on the client side, or apps, SDKs. Another one is more mathematical, and more programming together with statistics to do things like advanced, privacy enhancing tech. So to start at the top, where do you see the biggest impact of that role, the privacy technologies, before going any deeper?
I think traditionally, the way we've structured privacy is probably similar in many large organizations. I can't speak to startups or scale-ups or more, I would say, tech native, but let's take large B2C companies. I think we've stolen from the three lines of defense, which we've taken from audit. And you have your first line, which are the people actually building databases, building applications, etc. And they need to know how they also have to protect these systems and these data flows. And then you have your second line of experts, who have typically the compliance people there, who then can help you understand, how do we need to apply the GDPR to this thing? What are our internal policies? How do we translate indeed pieces of law to specific requirements? And then thirdly, you have your audit function. Now, I think the biggest value I see is bringing the first line and the second line much closer together, because ultimately a lot of this has to do with bottlenecks. If the entire organization is depending on typically 2 or 3 people to answer any kind of technical privacy related question, then you're creating a lot of friction. And I also see this additional set of legal requirements from the AI Act. We have all these new industry standards that are kind of bubbling up everywhere, and it's very hard to keep track of. On the other hand, we have a new way of building applications, which is really still very different from a completely static, controlled architecture that might be complex, but that's fully within the control, versus a much more dynamic interface with these models and more unpredictable behavior. And you see a lot of tension in these lines. And I think there as well, much of the response has to do with bringing tech expertise to the people, bringing privacy expertise and also AI risk expertise to the people building the AI agents and the models, and at the same time getting a much stronger technical background at the compliance teams.
If we start going down into something a bit more technical and going into auditing, what do you think is the place where you have the most impact?
I think ultimately this is about building a workflow in which at the beginning, there is a programmatic way of communicating privacy policies. So, for example, a policy is obviously that when I say reject all as a user in the consent management platform, we shouldn't have any form of profiling. We maybe in some jurisdictions have very basic forms of analytical tracking, but fully fledged analytical tracking with persistent identifiers should not take place. So that is a policy, right? And that is something that you and I can talk about in meetings, and we can write that down in a piece of paper. But what I think we need to do is also really encode that into a form of policy that we can enforce at the level of of a request, at the level of network traffic, at the level of actual data flows. That's the input. And then the output is that the owners of that specific tracker or the app or the product owner of the third party that you're working with, that ultimately that they know what to do. And this could be that there's code that needs fixing. For example, when we realize that there is a tag management issue and there's certain load rules that need to be configured, okay, that needs to go to the people owning the tag management. But what I see from time to time in my audits is that the code is all good, but that there's actually a bad behavior from a third-party vendor beyond your control, and then you have to speak to that vendor. And so then it's about dispatching this to the product owner or to someone within the legal team to confront a vendor with their behavior compared to the joint controller agreement or the DPA that's in place. And so ultimately, that's what it's about. Like, how can you set up a workflow in which a lot of people are contributing, and privacy people do privacy work, and technical people do technical work, but there is a system behind it. And I think that system requires first being able to observe actual data flows, which is harder on mobile than it is on web, and also harder server to server than this client to server. But then second, it really requires an understanding of network traffic. That's where I'm spending a lot of time on. It's like, how can we actually build a web of trackers, a understanding of what they do, not just at a vendor level, but you really need to understand this specific type of request is this type of instruction, right? You can work with a third party. There's many plugins that you can integrate, and then these plugins will have essential functionality, and there'll be small widgets, etc. And that's all good in the reject all scenario. But then at the same time, they might have tracking functionality. So you really need to go beyond just saying, "Well, this vendor is okay and this vendor is not okay." You really need to understand what's the kind of API call that these widgets, scripts, SDKs that they're doing. And then thirdly, you need to basically be able to match these policies that you've encoded with actual data traffic. And I think if you have that system in place, which is not necessarily going to work in every circumstance, but especially I think when it's about websites, mobile apps, CTV, I think this is the way we should be auditing those applications in production. I do want to add, Sergio, that I see a lot of value in what I would call a build process, right? Before we put big applications live, or before we're going on board a large third-party tracker, there's a lot of value in doing that DPA and doing the paperwork, right? And sitting down with those people. But a DPIA never survives deployment in the sense that at some point you have management bandwidth, you have room to change things, and then once you're deployed, you're not going to revisit a 30-page DPIA. Right, that's where you need to have this monitoring place. So I think that's how the two should complement. I think before you are making these big changes, you should definitely still invest in the traditional expert-led way of interfacing with the organization. But as soon as tech is live, and as soon as we're releasing new versions of the application or for mobile application, for example, that's where you need to have automated monitoring that then bubbles up to the privacy expert if it needs to, but also immediately goes to developers if they are the ones who need to work on that kind of compliance issue.
So there's programmatic happening in the sense that you can automate certain processes before you release because something is embedded into the process. So you're going through certain filters. And then there's manual or ad hoc auditing, which could happen before you release on production, before you deploy, but also after the fact. Do you see a lot of work as a firefighter?
It always starts with firefighting. The main trigger to audit applications is because there is a very specific investigation happening or a customer complaint. And I do think we need to backtrack a little bit and understand why. It's not because these companies are unprofessional or because they really underinvest in this area. I think it also has to do with just how complex testing is. Because let's even take a website. Like, anyone can open a website and look at network traffic, sure. But can you easily, as a human being testing this thing, account for all these different scenarios, all these different third parties? No, you need to. I think what ultimately the GDPR need privacy prescribe and what DPAs expect from companies does require some pretty sophisticated tooling. And I think there hasn't been as much enforcement as I would like, on this topic. There's still very much a let's see what happens kind of mentality or attitude to it. And so I think indeed the CNIL, for example, now doing their efforts on mobile applications is definitely shaking up things and really pushing privacy folks in France much more to kind of take this process seriously. And I think it's a good thing. The other thing that we have to understand it's also really much harder, for example, mobile and on websites to actually understand what's happening.
Enforcement is hard because you need to be very technical. So you look at, for example, the CNIL, they've invested a lot in technical teams. But you still, my problem with auditing on the client side is always that you were referring to this earlier on, that there's always something that is hidden in the sense that the call only tells you so much. Not just because of the kind of data they get, because that's another thing, like what's the nature of the data being submitted, right? Another one is that whoever you're making the call to in themselves represent the risk because of the entity receiving the data. So, for example, we're talking about data transfers. Some people have made the effort to map it to international data transfers, like Fu Analytics. We had Act Fu here in the show many months ago. And he was doing that, so adding a little flag to the call, to that pixel, to that server, and then see whether we would need. Then you would need somewhere else a lookup table to see whether they're using standard contract clauses or the data privacy framework if they're in the US. There's so much complexity into translating. How do you go around that?
It's absolutely true that there's a lot of complexity, and I think there's two thoughts that I have on this, Sergio. So I think on the one hand, I just have to confirm that this complexity is real, and I want to add something that is a common misconception. Understanding your code or SDKs is not enough, right? As soon as you're doing programmatic advertising, you have all these parties that are invited by the SDKs that you add on your website. So one or your application. So the biggest issue is actually that most of the concerning traffic is actually parties that you've never heard of. And that's often the reaction I get when we're kind of helping companies audit. They're like, who are these companies? The other thing is that I do want to, at the same time, set the expectations in the sense that typically authorities don't expect, at least in the cases that I've seen, they've really addressed very basic problems. So by that I mean, clear violations of analytical tracking, advertising tracking without consent, or clearly lacking any form of proper documentation on cookies and vendors. And so I think what we ultimately need is at least more maturity from all the app publishers to get the basics right. Because I have to admit that the basics are often not really properly done. I still see a lot of tracking, which is just blatantly no legal basis, can't be justified. At the same time, we definitely need more comprehension from data protection authorities on how what the different actors can do and how the tech works. And I think if you look at the recent case we had, it's already some time ago, but the case in Belgium around the IAB Europe TCF and the Belgian Data Protection Authority, I still feel that those two worlds don't understand each other, and that there's just still, and also I think at level of the EDBB when it comes to consent or pay and these kind of discussions, that there's still not really a good comprehension of how the tech works and where the real sensitivity is.
Good. So now we go a bit deeper into the technology and into embedding already programmatically or into the code and privacy enhancing technologies, privacy enhancing techniques, being able to get away from granular data into more aggregate, the identified data. And we've had some suppliers, software as a service companies that embed some safeguards, but there's also brands that may want to do it. So what kind of work do you see in that space, and what kind of trends do you appreciate in the market in terms of embedding safeguards into the code? So
indeed, I think there it's useful to look at, let's take the broader use case of how we activate people online, and how we try to market to them or advertise to them on different media. So the one big route is obviously following them around on the internet, let's say, and then trying to target them. I think what you see there is much more of a of large companies trying to build their own first-party audiences and protecting them much more. I think there's now a very interesting, almost a fight within the industry around who owns the customer identity and what we would call a persistent identity. So we're moving through the work of the privacy sandbox, which now has been, in a way, canceled. But the movement of third-party cookies toward first-party identities has been very important. And now the question is, who's going to own the first-party identity? How do we basically have this key that at the same time allows us for some sort of targeting in analytics and in advertising, but at the same time really prevents linking across the entire ecosystem? So that's now, I think, where there's interesting work, where I think all of the big vendors, you can take a LiveRamp, for example, or whatever, but it's actually not just the standard. It's also about how the publishers and the advertisers are going to be using these identities and try to find that balance between the ability to match, but also the inability to just have third-party intermediaries capture the key and grab all the data from the exchange. I think the other big thing you see, probably also as a result of the third-party sandbox, but also as a counter reaction to everything online, is there's so much more maturity I see right now in the data clean room space, in maybe what I see now is, first of all, a big adoption of data clean rooms. This is becoming a much more established way of doing things, and some of the most advanced targeting use cases are now facilitated by these data clean rooms, which ultimately allow you to do fully hashed, fully encrypted matching of user identities that are then being ultimately just like singled out to the level of a specific campaign, just saying these are the people you need to target, no further questions asked, at the level of then publishers and other media owners, right? So that is interesting. But you also see within that space now is, it used to be direct, so advertiser to publisher, but now you see other parties being thrown into the mix. So I think we're going to see a lot more of ecosystem plays in which the retailer owning shopping data is now going to try to use the data clean room to match some insights around a purchase intent with an advertiser and a publisher, so that there can be a campaign that's meaningful and targeted. And then that campaign might be fed back into the data clean room, and then they're going to try to see if they can have some kind of meaningful impact in stores as a result of it. So these kind of multi-party use cases are bubbling up as well, and probably you'll see more of these in the next 2 years. Now, if you look at the tech, especially in a data clean room, the tech is really sound, right? And I think as soon as we get homomorphic encryption and more of these even more advanced ways of doing the matching and ensuring the end-to-end encryption, this will get better. But the big barrier I see from a privacy point of view and really pulling this through is really just basic consent and transparency. This is where still a lot of issues are, where even if you're doing it in a data clean room, or even if you have taking the first big trend, even if you have cleaned up your act in terms of how you send persistent identifiers in real-time bidding requests, you still need to somehow make sure that this is based on a proper legal basis that is explainable to any kind of person, normally obviously without a tech background. And so that, I think, is still a big challenge. And obviously everyone wants to now create these kind of interesting ecosystem plays, but like, how do you make sure that consent and a basic understanding of where data goes gets to the customer? And I still see a lot of catching up that needs to be done there, because sometimes you'll have very interesting privacy preserving tech in place, but no proper legal basis to support it.
I still struggle with the way consent is gathered. I always say I'm so annoyed with consent banners, and that's why I also find beauty, if that's beauty, in being able to do things without so much data. And I believe you do have a framework for levels of intrusiveness and how far you can go. Can you speak to that?
So this is my data translator speaking, and indeed, Sergio, you can get quite confused about the mechanics of data clean rooms and the madness and the number of third parties involved in tracking. But all of the activation and advertising use cases, which is much of what we are concerned about as data protection experts, they ultimately boil down to identifying a user, be that through their device or through their account, And you can take that from just having the IP address, right, which you're sending across anyway, all the way to a device fingerprint, which is completely opaque and inherent to whatever device that you're using. The second thing is you want to know something about this person or device. So that's your insight. And that's always profiling. It's just about, can I understand something about this person or this device that helps me in whatever I want to do as a company, in order to tailor news, in order to advertise something. And there it starts with like the most basic device information. You are here on this page, all the way to, I have access to your precise geolocation, and I see I have access to maybe other sensitive pieces of information about you as that are, by the way, also persistent, such as actual character traits about me. And then finally, what are you going to do with the data? What's the tracking outcome or the profiling outcome? And that can be aggregating it all up to statistics, understanding the audience on your website or application, for example, all the way to data brokerage, cross-company profiling. And so I think I have this simple, 5-scale grid for each of these. And sometimes when I get lost, or when the companies I work with get lost, it's also about just kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, what kind of identity are we sending? Is this a persistent identifier or a random, in a way, ephemeral third-party ID that will only last for a session? And then trying to see, can we move left into the scale? Can we somehow remove some intrusiveness? And that is typically, if you've done that, that's also typically the basis of your legitimate interest assessment. So actually, as a basis for that, if you're relying on legitimate interest, that's also my basis for kind of structuring that conversation.
That's very good, Thomas. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, it was great to be here, Sergio. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it's a treat to be on.
Thank you, and now people know where to find you if you want to explore the framework or anything else. Thank you. Okay, that's all for today. Follow us on Blue Sky and in the Masters of Privacy Altogether profile, you will find the starter pack, which includes the feeds of all of our past guests. There is also a Masters of Privacy LinkedIn channel, which I invite you to follow, where you will find links to our transcripts, cheat sheets, and other surprises every now and then. Our main website is mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.